Have you ever factored, foiled, or failed? For many of us, math can be intimidating, especially with tough parabolems. There's certainly a learning curve, but if you go around writing equations indiscriminately, you run the risk of being labeled a square. Here are 3 stories where fear multiplied, and there was a quadratic formula for terror. This happened back in 8th grade, and to this day I'm not exactly sure what I saw. It was terrifying though, and I hope whatever it was never comes back. It was 5th period algebra class, and we were having a lecture on the quadratic formula. I know I'm not alone in thinking it was extremely complicated, and for zoning out in class. This was also right after lunch, so I would almost fall asleep sometimes. That included today. We were about halfway through class, I think, and our teacher, Mr. Capello, was telling us something about how the discriminant determined how many roots there were. Yeah, I don't know. I was on the brink of falling asleep again, so I asked to use the restroom in order to take a little break. Mr. Capello was actually really nice about letting kids use the restroom, maybe because it was so soon after lunch, and he said that was fine. Our school had 2 levels, a first floor and a basement, and I'd walk to the bathrooms in the basement since that meant I'd go up and down stairs. But just as I turned the corner to the staircase, I thought I could see this big shadow-like figure disappearing down the stairs. I froze. It didn't look like a person, as it was pretty tall, and I barely saw it. I was scared, but also curious, and eventually my curiosity won out. I slowly approached the staircase and looked downward, but I didn't see anything. For context, the basement level still had classrooms and lockers, as well as the band hall, but there were also storage rooms and I think offices. Because it was the middle of class, there wasn't anyone else around. I walked down the steps, trying to make as little noise as I could in order to hear anyone else that might be down there. It was pretty silent, as the band wasn't even practicing. But just as before, when I rounded the corner to the bathrooms, I saw the shadow quickly glide into the boys' restroom. I froze again, this time feeling more scared than curious. Could this be someone trying to mess with me? Like one of my friends noticing me in the hallway and figuring out where I was going? No. Even if they could somehow do that, how could they make this big dark area appear? I considered going back up the stairs, but deep down I had to know who, or maybe what, that was. Though the hallways were deserted, I still felt safe in the school as I could just run to a classroom if something happened. Cautiously I tiptoed to the entrance to the bathroom and looked inside. The motion sensing lights came on, meaning either no one was in there or they'd gone in before and stood still or waited in a stall. The girls' bathroom was right next to the boys', so I looked in there as well, and the motion-sensing lights came on too. I was pretty sure I saw that thing go into the boys' restroom, but I wasn't exactly sure that thing was real. My heart was racing as I walked inside and looked around and under the stalls. The entrance to this particular bathroom turned a corner, then went to the middle halfway between the stalls and sinks. I didn't see anyone by the sinks or urinals or under the stalls. The only thing left would be to open each of the 3 stall doors, so that's what I did. Before opening each one, I peeked through that narrow gap next to the door, but I didn't see anything. Then I opened each door. Nothing. Finally, I went over to the urinals, used it, and then washed my hands. All the while, I kept looking over my shoulder at the urinals and the exit. Still nothing. Then I put my hands underneath a paper towel dispenser, but after it let out a sheet of paper towel, my blood ran cold. There, coming from the direction of the stalls, was breathing. I started to panic, but still for some reason bent my head down to check under the stalls. I fell backwards when I saw a pair of black boots in front of the toilet in the last stall over. I quickly got to my feet and ran out of the bathroom, down the basement hallway and back up the stairs. Halfway up I thought I heard the sound of a bathroom door opening, and then manic footsteps behind me. Instinctively I looked back down, but there was nothing. When I got to the top of the staircase, I hid behind the corner and stopped. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, and there weren't any other sounds. Now I had a decision to make. I could either tell someone about what I saw, or just go back to class as usual. After a moment, I picked the second option. Even though I had just been terrified, I wasn't 100% sure what I saw was real, especially since I never got a good look at who or what that was. It also didn't make sense how it managed to get into one of the stalls without me noticing. Looking back as an adult and as a parent, I might have reported it since a school intruder is nothing to take lightly. But still, it didn't make any sense. The only other possibilities are that I was hallucinating, or what I saw was paranormal. This is the one extremely strange thing that's happened to me in my life, and I still have no explanation. I've never had a hallucination before, at least that I know of, and I don't get migraines or seizures or anything. I wasn't sleep deprived or hopped up on soda, and really, visiting the bathroom during that class wasn't out of the ordinary for me at all. So why I had that experience on that particular day, I have no idea. Ultimately, I'll never know, but there is one thing I think about sometimes. I probably wouldn't have seen that thing if it weren't for the quadratic formula. Freshman year of high school was rather rough for me, especially since my family moved across town and I knew almost no one here. I recognized like one or two people I'd seen before at various sporting events, but I never hung out with any of them. Math class didn't make things any easier, and as I'm sure many of us remember and would probably like to forget, parabolas were the bane of my existence. Our math teacher, Mr. Richter, tried to be one of those inspirational, you should learn math because it's awesome teachers. And maybe he managed to inspire some kids, but not me. This particular week, we were going over how different types of parabolas could cross the x-axis, and like usual, I was struggling just to know what was going on. Unfortunately, it was already Thursday, and there were tests on Fridays, so I was essentially screwed. We had to know how to tell how many times a parabola would intersect the x-axis by using factoring or the quadratic formula, and Photomath, YouTube, and other sites hadn't been cutting it. I wanted to get help from someone in my class, but didn't really know who. Therefore, when Mr. Richter had to leave class a few minutes early one day, I decided to make this half-joking announcement about how if anyone was going to bomb the test, they wouldn't be alone. The smarter kids didn't respond, but I did hear some sounds of agreement, and one other kid who I didn't know agreed with me loudly. In that same half-joking manner, I asked if he wanted to try to work together to get one more point on the test, and he said, yeah, sure. His name was Jeremy, and he seemed cool, and we ended up vibing together. We decided to set up at one of the tables after classes let out, and then catch the late buses our school had for various clubs and activities. At the end of the day, almost everyone went to their lockers and then to the buses. Jeremy and I felt like total nerds as we took a seat at one of the tables in the main lobby/eating area and got our books out. Our plan was to take one more look through the examples, and if things still didn't click, to go on YouTube and then Khan Academy. Now to this day, I'm still impressed that Jeremy and I were actually able to figure a few things out on our own. Apparently, if you use the AC method to factor a quadratic and get two different factors, then the parabola goes through the x-axis in two different areas. If you get two of the same factors, then it just touches in one place, and if it doesn't factor at all, the parabola doesn't touch the axis at all. When I'll actually use this in my everyday life, I don't have a clue, but we still had this sense of accomplishment. Jeremy and I were about to call it quits when he looked up and said, "Do you hear that?" The school was largely deserted now, and we didn't see anyone in the lobby area, though the track and field team was practicing outside, and a club or two were probably meeting in some of the classrooms. At first I didn't hear anything, but then I heard a distinctive metallic knocking sound. We realized it was the sound of someone dragging an object against the lockers, and assumed it was a kid coming in from outside or from one of the classrooms. Jeremy and I went back to doing the study guide, hoping to finish the last two questions before needing to walk over to the buses. But even after we finished the first problem, the person was still dragging that item across the lockers. The sound would stop at regular intervals as whoever that was went from one group of lockers to the next, and it seemed to get louder and softer as they apparently walked along through the hallways. It was now mildly annoying, but we were also curious and didn't really feel compelled to finish that last problem. Jeremy and I started putting our stuff away as we looked in the direction the sound was coming from, but that person never came out of any of the hallways leading into the lobby. There were like 3 different hallways on that side of the lobby, and Jeremy and I walked over to the one nearest to where we had been sitting. Jeremy asked me if I knew anyone who would be messing with us, and I told him I didn't. We guessed it was just some random kid. Right when we got to the start of the hallway, the noise stopped for several seconds, but started up again going away from us. Jeremy and I slowly walked down the hallway, which turned right into another hallway that intersected the other two coming in from the lobby. We turned the corner but didn't see the person, so we kept walking in the direction of the sound. But then when we got to the next corner, they were out of sight again, and a moment later the sound stopped. We only had like 5 minutes until we had to start walking to the buses, but Jeremy and I now really wanted to find whoever this was. The next logical move was for us to split up, so that's what we did. For the record, we didn't consider ourselves to be in any danger. Jeremy went back to the lobby while I stayed in the hallway, waiting for that person to pop into view. A second later, I heard the noise again, but instead of seeing another high schooler come around the corner, I witnessed something far more disturbing. It was some skinny dude in a white t-shirt with long, wiry hair who was hunched over and taking these long, exaggerated steps. Somehow I knew he wasn't a teacher and he wasn't supposed to be there. I froze and felt my heart in my throat, but I nearly died when I saw what was making that sound. At first I thought it was a baton, like in a relay race, but then I realized it was a gun. I instinctively ducked behind the corner, but it was too late. There was no way that dude didn't see me. I ran back to the lobby where I saw Jeremy waiting by the other hallway. He jumped back when I ran out and immediately knew something was wrong. Without saying anything, I motioned for him to follow me, and we started to run towards one of the exits. On the way, I told Jeremy that it was some older dude with a gun, and I could see that news hit him hard too. All the while we were running, I kept checking over my shoulder, but thank God that man didn't seem to follow us. When we got outside, the buses were already there, and luckily there were 2 teachers as well. We told them what happened, and they immediately started freaking out. One of them called 911 on her cell phone, while the other started yelling for every student to get on a bus now. Some kids started screaming as they ran for the doors, and we got on the nearest bus too. After it looked like everyone was on a bus, the teacher motioned for them to leave. I think the bus drivers were confused, especially since there were random kids on each bus, and they actually ended up driving a block or 2 away before pulling into this parking lot. As we were the only 2 kids who knew what happened, we told the people on our bus, and then people started talking through the open windows. 10 minutes later, a cop car showed up, and a cop came in and checked each of the buses. He told us that we were safe and to remain calm, and that our parents were on their way. Soon after that, parents started arriving, and all of them were freaking out, including my mom and Jeremy's mom. When Jeremy's mom came to get him, I said bye, and my mom showed up soon after that. I'll spare some of the details of the investigation, but long story short, the man that broke in had escaped from some kind of mental institution several months before. It wasn't clear where he had been during that time. Presumably he had been living on the streets. It also wasn't clear where he had gotten the gun, though thankfully it hadn't been loaded. Interestingly, the man didn't enter the school through any of the entrances. Rather, he had climbed in through a window one of the teachers left open, then walked out of the classroom door and closed it behind him. At some point, he must have just started wandering around, banging the gun on the rows of lockers, but as to why, no one knows. The school beefed up security after that, and I'm sure they got on whichever teacher it was that left their window open. But honestly, it was a pretty safe school, and nothing remotely that terrifying took place the rest of our time there. For follow-up, Jeremy and I actually did decently on the test the next day. Maybe it was that bonding experience, but we became lifelong friends. It's still fun whenever he or I meet someone new and tell that story. Looking back, I do still wonder what that man might have done to us if he reacted differently, even though the gun turned out not to be loaded. And I also think how strange it was that the thing that brought me and Jeremy together was quadratic functions. The beginning of my freshman year in high school, I was in this advanced algebra program called CMAPS that counted towards college credit. I was probably the stereotypical overachiever, and my parents did encourage me to push myself. Unfortunately, this algebra program was pretty tough. Even though it had this period devoted to self-study 2 days a week where I could meet with the teacher who ran it, it still wasn't enough time to get all my questions answered. I ended up having to work late into the evenings, and a few times I came close to dropping it. However, it did get substantially easier after that, or at least I got better at math, but in the beginning it indirectly led to a truly terrifying encounter. One day I stayed at school a bit later to take care of a few things, and as I missed the bus, I'd either have to walk home or have my dad pick me up. My mom was out of town to visit some of our extended family, and my dad didn't usually get off of work until 5. Our house wasn't actually that far away, it was only like a mile or 2. However, it was already starting to rain, and it was supposed to start downpouring. I also didn't have an umbrella. I texted my dad, and he said he had to work until 6 p.m. that evening, so it'd be a while. But honestly, it didn't even matter, since I had more than enough homework to do. I also brought food, so it wasn't like I was going to go hungry. Our high school had this long hallway with doors to the outside and trophy cases on the other wall on the inside. There were a few tables in the hallway. Why they were there I'm not sure, but I sat down at one and pulled out my book and notebook. It did indeed start raining harder, and luckily the sound was soothing and helped me concentrate. Not to nerd everyone out, but I still remember the problem I was working on. I had the quadratic equation y equals 2x squared plus 4x plus 9, representing a parabola, and I had to do various things with it. I had to write it in vertex form and focus directrix form, as well as find the focus, directrix, and latus rectum. I had maybe been working on it for a minute when I happened to look up and noticed there was someone else sitting at the table at the other end of the hallway. I'll mention that I went to a rather large high school, and even though I'd grown up in the area, I only knew a small fraction of the people in my class. I squinted and saw it was a boy with blonde hair who looked to be my same age, wearing a long-sleeved shirt and cargo pants. I couldn't tell if he had been looking at me, but when I looked at him, he quickly turned his head. Maybe I'm a bit paranoid, but him being there now made me uneasy, and I considered moving somewhere else. But apparently the guy noticed me looking around and came over. When he came over, he said hi and introduced himself as Jacob. I hadn't met him before, so I introduced myself as Heather. He just stood there for a moment, then looked outside and said it was raining. I could already see that for myself. Then he turned back to face me and asked if I wanted to borrow his umbrella. As I wasn't planning to leave before my dad picked me up, I said, no thanks. I expected that to be that, but Jacob didn't immediately leave. Instead, he sat down at my table and asked me how I liked school. Now, being a nerd, I wasn't the most social person, and right now I really just wanted to get through what I had to do so I could get to sleep at a decent hour. I said it was fine and looked back down at my notebook, but Jake didn't immediately leave. He seemed to be looking at what I was doing, which was annoying, but thankfully he eventually took a hint and got up and left a moment later. Jake walked back to the other end of the hall and sat down at that same table. I managed to get through most of the rest of that problem, but the fact that he was still sitting there and was possibly watching me started to become too much. I packed up my stuff and walked over to the windows to get a better look at the storm. I knew I'd get soaked walking home without an umbrella, but my backpack was waterproof, so it's not like anything would get damaged. I could try to find another place in the school, but I didn't like the idea of that guy still being somewhere in the building with me. I thought about texting some of my friends to see if they had an umbrella in their locker, but I knew it was a long shot. However, before I could even do that, Jake walked back over to me and offered me his umbrella again. I didn't know what to do in the situation, and felt this could be some kind of trick. Then he said he had another one and that it would be fine. I still didn't know what his intentions were, but I went ahead and accepted the umbrella and said thanks. Now that I had it, I definitely planned on leaving, so that's just what I did. I walked outside and was greeted with the sound and smell of fresh rain. Normally I wouldn't have minded walking home under an umbrella, and maybe it was just my state of mind, but something about that encounter with Jacob really creeped me out. I checked over my shoulder every few seconds expecting him to start following me, and then my heart sank when he came through the doors as well. I started walking faster down the sidewalk on the side of the road. Though my house was a mile or two away, there was another neighborhood closer, and I could head to one of my friends' houses. I looked over my shoulder again and saw that Jake was still walking in my direction, though he was falling farther behind. As I kept walking through the rain, I started to wonder if I didn't misjudge the situation. Maybe Jake was just a nice guy and assumed I would have to leave soon, since I was sitting at one of the tables by the door. But just then, as if to confirm my suspicions, I saw another figure walk directly into the sidewalk not even 100 feet in front of me, and stop. I couldn't make out all their features, but whoever this was looked to be older, like in his 40s. He was wearing a trench coat and had this tattered black umbrella, and seemingly appeared out of nowhere. There were a few trees to the side of the road, so it seemed he had been hiding behind one. I froze, and instinctively looked around to see Jake still approaching in my direction. There weren't any cars driving on the road, so I walked diagonally across to the other side. I shot through my veins when I noticed the man in the trench coat start to cross the road too. That was it. I dropped the umbrella in my backpack and started running. I screamed as I saw the man was only a few steps behind me, and then I felt him grab my waist and pick me up. I was punching and kicking, but that wasn't enough to escape his grasp. Then I heard another set of footsteps approaching, and a moment later I heard a loud thud, and the man screamed in pain. He let go, and then another thud came and he fell to the ground. I looked around and saw Jacob. He asked if I was alright, and for a moment I considered running away. But I figured that Jake wasn't acting, and that he and the man couldn't have been working together based on how hard Jake hit him. I fell into Jake's arms, and he put his arm around me. Just then, the man let out a groan and got up. both of us tensed, ready to defend ourselves, but the man ran away without even looking back. I'm not sure if Jake considered running after him, but the man was quick on his feet, so I doubt either of us could have caught him. After the man left our field of view, Jake walked with me back to get my backpack and the umbrella, then after that he walked with me to my house. The stress of the situation, both with what just happened as well as how math was going, made me open up to Jake a bit, and he turned out to be understanding. Jake was a freshman too, and wasn't having the easiest time in his classes either. Apparently he'd grown up here as well, though like I said, we went to a big high school and I knew almost no one there. Jake actually wasn't bad looking, and I was starting to feel the conversation, so when we got back to my house I invited him in. He didn't accept though, and told me he had to get going. I guess that made sense, since before rescuing and then walking back with me, he had started to walk home himself. I ended up not mentioning what happened to either my dad or friends, and in hindsight I know that wasn't the best decision, but I was still overflowing with homework and I didn't want to have to deal with anything else. The next day at school I looked for Jake but didn't see him, nor did I see him the day after that. I asked my friends to see if anyone knew him, but aside from teasing me that I liked him, they didn't know who he was, and I didn't want to push it further. Then the next week I saw Jake at his locker between classes. Though I was a bit nervous, I walked over and said hi. Jake seemed nervous as well, but maybe because of the experience we'd already been through, we managed to get over it. Jake and I exchanged phone numbers, and that weekend he took me to see the new Goosebumps movie. We started going out and ended up becoming high school sweethearts. Now we're in college, and Jake recently started working for this software firm. Our wedding date is in March. I think back to the day we met, including that horrific experience with the man, and I'm so thankful that I found the love of my life, and that things didn't end up differently. I also can't help but wonder what would have happened if I wasn't working on those tough quadratic equations.